Mahler's Fifth Symphony is a big symphony in every respect. Big orchestra, lasts well over an hour, 5 movements, and it's also big in the emotional demands it makes of us too. There's something about Mahler's music, almost immediately when you listen to it, you know that the feelings are strong. You're not just meant to sit and enjoy them passively, you're meant to get involved. But there's a whole question as well when you listen to a piece of music that's well over an hour's long, that doesn't have voices, a story, a title, a program to help you, or anything at all, which is what actually is going on here. Mahler clearly felt that his symphonies told stories. But what kind of stories and how much should you help the audience? At first, he thought the audience needed a lot of help. So he gave his first symphony a title, Titan, and wrote a very long program to explain what he felt happened in its 4 movements. And he did almost the same with the second symphony, which is known as the Resurrection Symphony. And perhaps you need an explanation there even more, because here's a symphony that begins with a colossal funeral march and ends with a hymn to the immortality of the soul, resurrection. So some sort of story is being told there, isn't there, about death to life? And as I said, Mahler wrote a big program note to explain it. The trouble is, even when you write really detailed program notes, people would get the wrong idea. Alma Mahler, that's Mahler's wife, remembered how when Mahler conducted his Resurrection Symphony in Petersburg, an old lady came up to him at the end of the concert and said, "Well, you obviously know an awful lot about what's going to happen to us after we die, so perhaps you could tell me what I'm going to expect." Apparently she wasn't best pleased when Mahler said, "Well, I don't really know. It's all speculative." So gradually he dropped the idea of titles and he dropped the idea of programs. But the Fifth Symphony is the first one that doesn't have a title, doesn't have a text sung by anybody, a soloist or a chorus, and only leaves musical clues as to what it's about. Again, like the Resurrection Symphony, it begins with a funeral march. Mahler loves his funeral marches, and the one at the beginning of the Fifth Symphony is a particularly spectacular example, terrifying and desolate all at the same time. And it's also pretty clear, after we've heard this funeral march, that some sort of struggle begins, as though Mahler is trying to find some kind of solution to or answer to this terrible vision of death that he's put forward in the first movement. What happens? Well, that's when the arguments start, interestingly, because the symphony doesn't follow a kind of straightforward course at all. After the second movement, which seems to aspire towards the light, represented by a magnificent hymn tune played on the brass, that collapses again. Then suddenly there's a complete change into a kind of wild manic waltz for the third movement. We get to the end of that, the music seems to have danced itself into some sort of resolution, and then comes the beautiful adagietto, the movement from this symphony that's best known for strings and harp. Mahler apparently conceived this as a kind of song without words, a love song without words for Alma, who he'd actually met while he was writing the symphony. And then in the finale, this song without words, other ideas from earlier in the symphony, including that big hymn tune from the second movement, are all brought together. And at the end, there's an unmistakably positive sounding conclusion, with the chorale sounding out again, chiming bells suggested in the surging strings, and finally a great shout of joy from the full orchestra. So, death to life with love in the middle. And when you know that Mahler met Alma while he was writing the symphony, and that actually he began the symphony after he had himself a bit of a near-death experience as a result of a rather nasty hemorrhage, which had resulted in his having an operation, it all seems to make sense, doesn't it? And yet, music isn't like words. It doesn't tell stories literally. We are, in a sense, left to reach our own conclusion about what's going on. And you can see this in the way that people react to this symphony. Some people find the end of the symphony incredibly convincing, thrillingly positive. It's a hymn. It's revealed, if not to God, then to love, to the power of love that's transformed Mahler's life and really given him a new sense of purpose and brought him the love of his life, his wife, Alma. Other people don't find it quite so convincing. They say, but is that triumph at the end entirely convincing? Have those memories of the dark shadows from the other symphony, from earlier in the symphony, been banished? Well, in a sense, that's not a criticism of the work. You could say that Mahler's just being a little bit more modern. After all, how often in our lives do we experience unalloyed, uncomplicated triumph? Things are rarely that straightforward. So this is a vision of life, love, transformation, hope, but it's complex. And one of the joys about this symphony is you can go back and experience it again and again, and each time hear something different, hear a different kind of angle. At the same time, I mean, it's, well, like all great symphonies, it's full of terrific tunes that you want to come out humming. And the interesting thing is the way that Mahler uses those tunes, because like Beethoven before him, his great hero Beethoven, Mahler realized that something that sounds really dry and academic, like development of themes, can actually be something that makes musical stories really vivid. That the way that the ideas are changed are rather like the adventures of a character in a novel or a play or a film. You know, we expect a character in a film or a play or a novel to be changed by the experiences that they have. And that, in a sense, is what happens to Mahler's themes. I'll give you one example. At the beginning of that second movement, which comes after the Funeral March with its terrifying vision of death, an idea is screamed out by the high woodwind, which sounds really desperate. But when it reaches the climax, it's transformed into something which sounds more positive. You see what I mean? There's a kind of hope in that. At the beginning of the next movement, that Manic Waltz I referred to, at first it sounds as if he's suddenly throwing all sorts of new ideas at us. But in fact, the opening idea, that it's that same striving idea we've heard in the previous movement that was originally so desperate and eventually so hopeful. And at the very end of the symphony, it's that hopeful version of the theme which comes back. In other words, even something which seems dry, as I said, and abstract, like the development of themes, is part of the way this music tells its extraordinary story. Sometimes it's so vivid, it's almost like watching a film. There's something almost like a cinema score about Mahler's music. It does make you wonder if he'd lived and, like other Jewish Austrian composers of his generation, had gone to America, whether he mightn't have made a terrific career in Hollywood. You never know, but it's one of those we'll never know, because, of course, Mahler died in 1911 at the age of just 51. Well, it's amazing what he did manage to achieve even in that relatively short life. And the Fifth Symphony has long been one of his most popular achievements. It's a fascinating piece. It's one you can come back to again and again and always discover something new in. So much seems to happen. And yet at the end of it, you feel as if you've been taken on a journey by a master storyteller. And that's, I think, one of the things that music can do most powerfully. It can tell stories that reach us, get us absolutely in our guts, as it were, speak to us directly, physical, almost on an animal level. And that's, I think, one of the things that makes this symphony so thrilling. It's also terrifically, excitingly scored. If Mahler ever wrote a concerto for orchestra, it would probably sound a lot like this symphony. Every section of his large orchestra gets its turn in the spotlight. Everyone's expected to work really hard, and it needs a terrific conductor, not only to keep up the energy, but to keep everyone focused on the task. And I don't think we could do much better than Vasily Petrenko tonight for bringing all of that out. There's a lot of stress on self-belief these days. If you really believe yourself, you can achieve anything. Well, I doubt if I could ever become a professional footballer, but you get the basic idea. Schubert, however, Franz Schubert, is an amazing exception to this. He seems to have had extraordinarily little faith in what he achieved. His Fifth Symphony, for instance, which he wrote at the age of 19, is an absolutely gorgeous piece. It's one of the most popular, shorter, modern orchestral works. It turns up in programs again and again, but we don't even know if Schubert ever heard it. He wrote it for an amateur orchestra in Vienna, where he lived. We can't be certain they played that, and he never made any further effort to get it performed at all. which seems extraordinary. And actually, amazingly, several years later, a conductor wrote to him and said, actually, no, we like your songs and we like your choral pieces. Have you written anything for orchestra we could play? And Schubert sends back this astonishing letter saying, alas, there's nothing I could send out into the world with a clear conscience. And I'd far rather you played something by Beethoven than I should show myself up with anything mediocre. And by this stage, he's written the first 6 symphonies and at least the first 2 movements of his famous unfinished symphony. The idea that he doesn't think that any of that's good enough is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? Well, there you go. And it's fortunately thanks to other people's belief in him that we have so much Schubert today. It's often said that if he'd lived longer than his tragically short 31 years, what might Schubert have achieved? Well, what might we have lost if he hadn't had a scrupulous brother and friends who collected the manuscripts and stored them and saved them until the interest in Schubert grew after his death. This little piece is a gem, and it's an interesting kind of almost like a diversion from Schubert's course up to this point, but a highly productive one. In his early days, and certainly in his later years, Schubert absolutely revered Beethoven. It seems they never actually met because Schubert was too shy. He was actually one of the torchbearers at Beethoven's grand funeral in 1827. But by the time he wrote the 5th Symphony, he seems momentarily to have fallen out of love with Beethoven and to have fallen back in love with Mozart. And there's something about Mozart's elegance, his grace, the beautiful sensuous intimacy in the way he writes for instruments. So they almost seem as if they're in conversation with each other. And the incredible kind of poise of the lyricism. Schubert's always a wonderful composer of melodies, but here there seems almost a kind of courtly elegance to some of the writing. Mind you, there's also moments of real rustic Austrian charm, such as you find in Schubert too. But the interesting thing is, even when you can point to a particular movement in this symphony, like the 3rd, and say, well, that's obviously written by a young composer who admires Mozart's 40th Symphony, it still sounds like Schubert. And I suppose that's the kind of alchemy of genius, isn't it? That even when a composer, a really good composer, imitates another composer, it still ends up sounding like the composer we know. And that's the fascinating thing with Schubert. Very often he modeled his bigger pieces on works by Beethoven, by Mozart, by Hummel, for instance, another great contemporary. And yet it always sounds like Schubert. Sometimes he even outdoes his model. What he does is even fresher and more original, and certainly full of those incredible melodies that are just so much part of Schubert's thinking. This is a lovely, high-spirited, charming work with very few shadows in it. There are a lot more shadows in Schumann's later works. When I say later works, I'm talking about a young man who died at the age of 31. So talking about late Schubert is a bit of an oxymoron. But all the same, this is a remarkable example of really serene creation and of a composer learning something in the process of imitating another, which is to be invaluable to his later development. And as I said, he doesn't seem to have made any effort to get it published or performed at all.